The most helpful person in the room is usually the first one to get used, not because they lack intelligence, because they spent years becoming the person who always helps, who never asks for anything back. That's not weakness. But somewhere along the way, that reputation spread to the wrong people. Manipulators don't target difficult people. They move toward the generous, the ones who were raised to believe that discomfort in another person is a problem they should help solve. Generosity is a signal, and not everyone who reads it is grateful. Most content about generosity focuses on one side of the equation, but there's a shadow side that almost never gets discussed. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it implicates people we don't want to see clearly. The things that make you good, showing up, caring, helping without being asked, those aren't invisible. Some people see them, and not all of them are grateful for it. Some of them are just looking for someone they can take from. You probably already sense this. You've felt it. The friend who only calls when something's wrong, the colleague who somehow always needs a favor, the person who makes you feel guilty for having a limit. What you may not know is that this isn't random. It's not bad luck. It follows a pattern, and that pattern has been studied. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how manipulative people identify, test, and systematically exploit generous people, and more importantly, what the exit looks like without becoming someone you don't recognize. This is not about becoming guarded. It's about becoming precise. When generosity is unconditional and unexamined, it broadcasts a specific set of permissions. Call it the open door signal. When someone consistently shows up, absorbs discomfort without complaint, and makes others feel their needs are valid, they're not just being kind. They're demonstrating that their time, energy, and emotional resources are accessible, freely, without a clear cost. That's a powerful thing to broadcast. In healthy relationships, it builds deep trust. But in the presence of certain personalities, particularly those who relate to others transactionally, or who have learned to navigate the world through manipulation rather than reciprocity, that signal reads differently. It doesn't read as warmth. It reads as availability, as softness, as a door that doesn't lock. The analogy that fits, a store that never checks receipts at the door, isn't just trusting its customers. It's also selecting for shoplifters. The store didn't do anything wrong. But it's operating in a world where not everyone shares its assumptions about honesty, and ignoring that reality has a cost. Psychologists Ramani Durvasula and Bill Eddy, both researchers of high conflict and narcissistic personality patterns, have independently documented something consistent. People who exploit others tend to pre-screen targets. They probe for tolerance of boundary violations before escalating. They are not random. They are, in a low-key way, strategic. The generous person isn't chosen by accident. Empathy is not invisible. It shows up in facial expressions, in how quickly someone apologizes, in the way a person shifts their posture when someone else is upset, and how often they check whether the other person is okay. For most people, these signals are background noise. They're just how a decent person behaves. But for individuals who've spent years reading social dynamics as a survival mechanism or as a manipulation strategy, empathy is information. Research from psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen at Cambridge draws a distinction between effective empathy, actually feeling what another person feels, and cognitive empathy, understanding what another person feels without necessarily sharing it. Most generous, caring people score high on both. Certain personality profiles, particularly those associated with dark triad traits, score high only on cognitive empathy. They can read you. They don't feel with you. That asymmetry is the foundation of exploitation. Consider the pattern documented in chronic workplace exploitation cases. A 2017 organizational behavior study from the University of Notre Dame found that high agreeableness employees, those who score high on cooperation, empathy, and helpfulness, are disproportionately assigned informal labor, unpaid mentoring, emotional support roles, taking on tasks others decline. They're not asked because they're capable. They're asked because they've made it socially uncomfortable to say no. A real example from that research: A mid-level employee, described as the person everyone goes to spend an estimated 20% of her working hours on other people's problems, none of it acknowledged in her performance review. She wasn't exploited by a villain. She was exploited by a system that had learned her limit didn't exist. When your helpfulness has no visible cost, people stop calculating whether they're overusing it. Manipulative people don't announce themselves. They run tests, small ones, at first. A request that's slightly too large for the relationship's age. An emotional disclosure designed to generate obligation. A guilt implication slipped into casual conversation. I just don't know who else to ask. You're the only one who gets it. I knew I could count on you. These aren't mistakes in wording. They're probes. What they're testing is, how much will this person absorb before they push back? What's the cost of asking for more? If you respond by helping, by absorbing the slight overreach without naming it, you've just answered the question. You've told them there's room to go further. This is what Lundy Bancroft, in his clinical work with manipulative relationship dynamics, calls the compliance pattern. Each small capitulation resets the baseline. What felt like a big ask 6 months ago now feels normal. The generous person didn't change, the reference frame did. This pattern doesn't only show up in toxic relationships. It appears in friendships, in families, in professional dynamics where a high performer becomes the team's informal therapist, crisis manager, and cleanup crew, all without compensation, all because they never said that's not mine to carry. Here's what makes this personally uncomfortable. The test often feels like trust. It feels like intimacy. Being the person someone comes to feels meaningful. And that feeling, that sense of being needed, is part of why the pattern is so effective. Manipulative people are often very good at making exploitation feel like connection. This is the layer most people never see clearly, even when they're inside it. Once a pattern of generosity has been established, once the open door signal has been accepted and tested, the most sophisticated exploitation doesn't work through requests anymore. It works through guilt. The architecture looks like this. Every act of generosity creates an implicit expectation. Not in you, in them. You've set a precedent. And when you eventually, inevitably, have a moment where you can't give, you're tired, you have your own crisis, you simply say no, they don't respond with understanding. They respond with injury. The withdrawal of your generosity is framed as a betrayal, as if your baseline was a promise, as if what you gave freely was a commitment you've now broken. This is what researchers at UCLA studying emotional manipulation patterns have called retrospective entitlement, the psychological reframing of past generosity as evidence of obligation going forward. You didn't give them your time. You established that your time belongs to them. The mechanism is brutal in its simplicity, and it works because generous people with high empathy, are genuinely susceptible to guilt. They feel the discomfort of having disappointed someone, even when the disappointment is manufactured, even when the grievance is invented. The story that captures this most clearly is not a dramatic one. It's quiet. A woman in her mid-40s, call her Elena, spent 11 years as the family anchor. Every holiday organized, every crisis absorbed, every relative who needed a loan, a place to stay, emotional support, all of it came to her. She gave because she wanted to, because it mattered to her. The year she was diagnosed with a serious illness and needed to pull back, not permanently, just for a season, she became the subject of family resentment. She was described as not herself, as difficult, as having changed. She hadn't changed. Her capacity had temporarily shrunk. But to the people who had built their lives around her unlimited availability, the limit felt like a betrayal. That's not coincidence, that's architecture. She had been slowly positioned, through years of absorbed obligation, as someone whose limits were not legitimate. Practical insight, guilt that arrives the moment you enforce a limit, is not evidence that you did something wrong. It's evidence that your limit was unexpected, and that someone had not planned for it to exist. The obvious response to this video is to become less generous, to harden, to pre-screen everyone, to treat every request with suspicion. That response is understandable. and it's wrong. Because the problem isn't generosity. The problem is generosity without discernment. There's a version of this lesson that people take too far, and it turns them into something they didn't want to become. Guarded in ways that repel good relationships. Transactional in ways that hollow out meaning. There's also a failure mode inside the lesson itself, pattern matching everyone who needs help as a potential manipulator. That's not wisdom. That's trauma response wearing a psychology lesson as a disguise. The research is clear on this. The happiest, most socially successful people are not the ones who give the least. They're the ones who give with the most precision, who are genuinely generous with people who reciprocate, and genuinely unavailable to people who extract. The question isn't how to stop being generous. The question is, how do you protect the generosity you have so it doesn't get systematically drained by people who were never going to give anything back? The shift that matters is not behavioral, it's perceptual. Most generous people are trying to manage outputs, how much they give, when they say no, how to enforce limits without conflict. That's the wrong level to work at. Because if you don't change how you read people, you'll just feel guilty about every limit you enforce. The real change is learning to distinguish between someone who needs help and someone who needs you to have no limits. Those are not the same situation. They require different responses. Here's what that distinction looks like in practice. First, watch the direction of effort over time, not in the moment. Manipulative dynamics almost always show a one-directional pattern across time. In any individual interaction, it can look balanced. One person asks, the other gives, there's warmth, there's gratitude. But zoom out over 6 months, a year, and ask, who has ever been inconvenienced for who? Who has shown up uninvited? Who has absorbed cost to make the other's life easier? If you do this exercise and the answer is uncomfortable, you haven't failed. You've just collected information you needed. Second, pay attention to what happens the first time you say no. Not what they say, what they do. Someone with healthy expectations will be disappointed sometimes. They'll say so. And then they'll adjust. They'll find another solution. The relationship continues. Someone who operates through extraction will not adjust cleanly. There will be escalation, either emotional withdrawal, guilt induction, or a subtle reframing that makes your limit feel like a character flaw. You've changed. I thought you cared. I guess I just expected too much. That response is data, not about your limit, about their relationship to your limits. Third, build reciprocity into your generosity early, not as a test, but as a structure. This is the insight that changes everything for people who've been chronically overgiving. Reciprocity isn't transactional. It doesn't mean keeping score. It means building relationships where both people carry the relationship's weight, not by splitting every cost, but by each person being willing to absorb cost for the other. A researcher at the Wharton School, Adam Grant, spent years studying givers, takers, and matchers in organizations. His finding: the most successful people were givers, but only the ones who gave strategically, who distinguished between those who reciprocated and those who didn't, who learned to be generous without being what he called selfless, meaning giving in ways that depleted them for people who never intended to give back. The generous person in that framework isn't hardened. They're calibrated. And there's a name for what they build: selective generosity. Giving that's abundant inside relationships that deserve it, and quiet outside relationships that have shown they'll consume everything offered without a second thought. That's not cynicism. It's sustainability. The most helpful person in the room. The one everyone goes to. The one who shows up. That person isn't the problem. Their instinct isn't the problem. The instinct to help, to be present, to absorb someone else's difficulty, that is one of the more valuable things a person can be. The problem is operating with that instinct in a world where not everyone shares it, and pretending that everyone does. The most powerful thing a generous person can do isn't to become less generous. It's to become selective enough that their generosity still means something. Because generosity that gets systematically depleted by people who were never going to reciprocate isn't virtue. It's a resource being harvested. And there's no honor in that for anyone. The people who deserve your generosity are not diminished when you stop giving it to people who don't. One question for the comments. Think about the most draining relationship in your life right now. Professional, personal, family. When's the last time that person absorbed cost for you? Not words. Cost.